Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I am Elizabeth, the events coordinator from Gibson's Bookstore, and I am very happy to welcome you to this virtual event for Nina Nesseth, joining us tonight for Nightmare Fuel, the science of horror films. I'm tapping out for this one because I am a delicate flower. And I know I joke about it, but I have literally fainted, hit the wall on the way down to the floor watching horror movies. So I have learned my limits. Ryan is our queen of Scream from the bookstore. She's usually the one who says, Elizabeth, I read it and you cannot read this. Or Elizabeth, no, this one, you'll be fine. She's got my back. Just like she has my back for this event tonight, she will be in conversation with Nina as they discuss all the things that go bump in the night and keep me from sleeping. Tonight, Nightmare Fuel is available from Gibson's Bookstore. We are happy to ship it out to you. You can pop into the store and grab your copy. If you are watching this later on YouTube, please, what do they say? Like, subscribe, and tell your friends,
leave a comment, share.
But tonight, to our audience members, there is a chat sidebar. Please do put in the chat sidebar what your favorite horror movies are. People are asking which movie made me faint. The one that was the worst for me was, I think it was The Girl Next Door, which had some torture in it and it was horrifying, but that's enough about me. Tonight, please join me in welcoming Nina Nesseth. Take it away.
Thank you. And yeah, to be fair, exactly what's going on in the comments is The Girl Next Door is a brutal one.
It is.
So I don't blame you one bit.
Valid. Yeah. But I am the queen of Scream and lover of all things horror. So I'm going to fill Elizabeth's shoes tonight and chat with you. So Nina, I'm so excited that you're here tonight. Thank you so much for being here. This is amazing. I'm so psyched. This book rocks, by the way. Everyone in the chat, this book rocks. I wrote a staff pick for it yesterday and I was just like completely feral typing my review. I was like, I don't even know, like everyone who likes horror needs this book because it's fascinating and awesome and funny and so informative, but also so readable, and like just everybody needs this book. It's so good. How did this book come to be? Give us your backstory, Nina.
Sure. Well, I've always been really interested in writing at the sort of intersection between pop science and pop culture. Like my background is specifically in like biomedical biology and science communication. And by day, I spent all of my time working at a science center where I developed like exhibits and engaged directly with audiences to teach different science concepts. So like that's already in my wheelhouse. And then I sort of moonlight as this like pop culture, pop science writer, and have been writing sort of science of the scare type articles for years. But what led to Nightmare Fuel was sort of, I guess, maybe a little bit petty, because I find that around Halloween every single year we get the same articles from every single outlet that's like, this is why we love scary movies. And it's always just talking about fight or flight and how, watching horror movies and seeing simulated threats on screen triggers that fight or flight response in our brains and bodies, as if we're experiencing that real threat. And like, that's part of the picture, but there's so much more to that, so much more so that I can write a whole book about it. And so it was really fun to sort of look at horror movies and pick them apart where it comes from. Not only like presentations of like threats and violence, but also like monster design and sound. Like sound is such a huge part of horror, and without it, like things wouldn't nearly be as scary. And there are just so many elements that I find just never get to see get into readers' eyeballs, because we sort of get to the fight or flight response and then stop. Mm-hmm. So that's how I got into Nightmare Fuel.
I love it. Yeah. Thinking of sound and soundtracks and things like that is like, we all talk about the jump scare. The jump scare without the stinger, the musical stinger, is nothing. It's nothing. So I loved that there's a whole section in your book where you like interview some folks who do music for horror, and you talk about the music of horror, which is really, really cool. I mean, I think of like there are some horror soundtracks that are instantly recognizable, like Halloween. Like even before I had seen Halloween, I knew the Halloween soundtrack. Like,
And just John Carpenter's scores in general, as soon as you like watch, I was watching a movie just the other day. Of course, I can't remember what it was. Oh, I think it was actually like the new Firestarter movie, which was like, it was fine. But it like right away, I was just like, oh, this is a John Carpenter score. Like you recognize it, and it kind of sets you up for a certain kind of experience. And it's just really, really cool. And it's like the sting, yeah, absolutely in the jump scare, but also everything leading up to that sting is so carefully tuned to sort of get you to play along and prepare for something, whether it's a fake out and we're not actually going to get a jump, or that actual jump, right?
yes. Yes. Oh gosh, I love, there you have a quote in the book that is something to the effect of the terror is in the tension. Like that's where the terror lies. And I just was like, yes, it is. And I love when directors totally lean into that. And I love when they play with tropes, and they play with like the fake outs, and you're all tensed up for the jump scare, and then it doesn't happen, and then it doesn't happen, and then it does happen. It's just it's great. Can you tell I could literally just gush about horror for like hours? I'm gonna try
perfect.
not
You're
to.
my people.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the research that you've done for this book, and you've been writing articles and things like this, so I guess it's always kind of on your mind, but I was curious if prior to writing this book, you had sort of a staple of horror favorites, and did any of those change over the course of writing this book and watching things that you hadn't seen yet? And did you discover any kind of subgenres of horror that you hadn't watched yet?
Yes, actually, yeah. So a few things happened. Before Nightmare Fuel, I think my old standbys are, and don't get me wrong, I know that there's a lot of like very excellent horror, but my standby is The Faculty, like from like 1998. That's my like comfort horror. It's much more comforting than Hereditary, Kristen. And I'm also, it's a romp, and like Robert Patrick as that coach, for those of you who've seen it, like you can tell that he just came off of like Terminator 2, and like still has that mindset and that sort of muscle memory, and is just like bringing that energy to this teen horror film. And he just like gets the assignment so perfectly, and like everyone is spot on in that movie. So that's my comfort horror. And otherwise, like I tend towards like possession narrative. Someone mentioned Veronica in the chat, and I was like, yeah, Veronica. And like haunted house stories. But for the book, obviously I had to expand my scope, and some of the things that I tended to avoid ended up being some of my favorites. Because I tend to I don't like as much body horror as I think I would like as a Canadian. It's very important for people to know, if they don't know already, that body horror is kind of like very important to Canadian horror. We have Cronenberg, after all. We have both of the Cronenbergs. Among other body horror directors and storytellers. And I hadn't seen really any Cronenberg films from his horror stable before writing Nightmare Fuel, and I watched them all, and they were so gross but so intriguing from a science perspective. And the other thing that I really, really shy away from are like cannibalism narratives, which meant that it took me forever to watch Raw.
Yep.
And that movie's fantastic. Raw is amazing. I'm so mad that I didn't watch it just because of me being a complete weenie and not wanting to like check out a cannibalism movie. So good.
And I do want to point out, there is a watch list in this book at the end. So you'll be reading it and you'll be like highlighting like, oh, I need to watch that, or, oh, I want to watch that again. They're all in here. broken down by chapter. And then Nina, you said you also created a letterboxed.
I did create a letterbox list of all the movies it mentioned in Nightmare Fuel, and once I find it, I'll drop it in the chat for people if you want to like track it on Letterboxd.
Yes. We can do big group watches and it'll be delightful. That's so interesting. Yeah, it's there's a part in the book that had me cackling because you were talking about, I think it was where you were talking about habituation versus desensitization and how, the more you watch something, kind of the easier it gets. And you were talking about and you were also talking about, and this may have even been a separate section, but you were talking about memory and how we like remember things as worse than they were. And you were talking about Saw. And I busted up laughing because this was my exact experience watching Saw. Okay. So Saw came out when I was in high school. And everyone I knew who saw it was describing these horrific things, just the most disgusting things. And they're going into such detail. And I was like, I don't do body horror. I don't do gore. Like I was like, I'm down with possession. I'm down with ghosts. I don't want to see somebody being tortured. So for years, I avoided Saw like the plague. And then like, I think it was 2 years ago, I was doing my 31 Nights of Halloween challenge. And I was like, you know what? Enough time has passed. The effects will not be super great. I'm going to do it. I'm going to finally suck it up and watch Saw. And when I tell you everything is off screen, I was like, did I go to school with a bunch of wimps? but it was them filling in the gaps and like remembering, literally seeing these horrible things, but that was all their brains.
Yeah, it's just your brain being brilliant at like remembering certain context clues and just like filling it in for you. And it's so good at doing that. But yeah, my wife and I are just like, we're most of the way through rewatching all of the Saw movies. And we're like, wow, it is just like police procedurals with some really, really gnarly concepts, but we don't really see that much of it yet. But your brain fills in the rest. So like when you're calling back to it, you're not remembering that you barely saw any of the action. Right. But you remember, whoa, like this whole contraption that was connected in this way and doing this and peeling back that layer of flesh is so wild and nasty, because it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And I still am not like, I have a hard time with body horror and like the torture porn type. It's like, I can watch it. I'm probably not going to seek it out. But one of my favorite tricks, and I passed this on to everyone, and it was in your book, which I was delighted by, is the, instead of closing your eyes, close your ears. Because again, the sound is worse than what's happening on screen. And it's funny because the person who gave me that tip is Josh Mallerman.
Oh my gosh, really? That's so funny.
And Pearl.
And that makes so much sense with Bird Box. Yeah.
Yeah. He was like, no, just cover your ears. And I was like, that's genius.
Yeah. And I realized that through like trial and error. Obviously too, there's like, there's research to support that. But my own personal experience was like, I've just given myself horrible nightmares. I'm sure other people in the chat have too, just like by trying to listen only. I think the most recent one, like this is even as an adult, like one of the last episodes of Black Mirror, the Black Museum.
Yeah.
I couldn't handle the pain addict segment. Mm-hmm. So I like turned my head and like watched it in the reflection of like my patio door, instead of like looking at it directly. And my wife was next to me. She's like, it's actually not that bad, Nina. But I was listening to the whole thing and I couldn't handle it. Like I would see like my phone charger on the floor and I'm like, I can't do this. I can't. Yeah. Everything's threatening.
Everything is terrifying. Oh man. Yeah, no, that's so legit. Yeah. Are there types of horror for you still that you're just like, nope, hard limit, I won't do it? Or are you kind of open to kind of everything? Like, I feel like at this point you've watched so much of everything.
Yeah, certainly. I'm in the same boat where I'm very choosy about what sort of extreme violence and torture that I'll go into. And like obviously I'll give certain things a chance. I'm not an Eli Roth fan, mostly because he's sort of that testament torture porn director from that like post 9/11 era, where the point is to have torture without like any sort of resolution,
Right.
Or any sort of like it's torture for torture's sake. And like, yes, interesting commentary on nationalism, et cetera, whatever. It's for other people. It's not for me. But like, I will watch a lot of the French extremity films. Like I think I've said it in like every interview / event I've done so far, but I really like Martyrs. Like, it's gonna bite me. I'm gonna rewatch this movie and be like, oh, maybe it's not a beautiful movie, but like I think it's a beautiful movie.
I love that.
And has and it's just, but like, and it has the same sort of bleakness to it, but like there is sort of a narrative arc that properly justifies, let's say, like to the characters who are doing it, what's happening, where I'm able to like, follow and watch it for, a story about relationships, a story about belief and hope and that sort of stuff. And also have some really horrific violence on screen. It still like hurts to watch a little bit, but I'll watch that over something that's more in that torture porn category.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's funny, we keep talking about our comfort horror that keeps coming up, that for folks who are watching this later, that spawned from the chat. We're talking about comfort horror movies, which is a foreign subject to people who are not into horror. That probably is very confusing to them. But I do want to talk about that a little bit. And I promised I would tell my Ring story. So I'm going to tell my Ring story. So The Ring came out when I was in middle school, and I was like about to have a Halloween party. And I was like, we're going to watch The Ring because none of my friends have seen it yet. And I'm so excited. It's like finally out on video. Oh my God. So I rented it a week early so that I could watch it early and know when all the jump scares are going to happen, and like look all cool to my friends for not even like flinching, because wow, I'm so cool. And so I post up in my my room upstairs with my TV. It's all dark, I'm alone, and I'm like, great, let's watch The Ring. And I watch it and I love it and it's fantastic. And I turn off the TV and I go to leave the room and static. Sorry, what? No, thank you. Nope. Nope. We're not doing that. Turn the TV off, sprint to my bedroom, hide under the covers from Samara for the rest of the night. And then I woke up to the phone ringing. Amazing. Oh boy. Then I went downstairs and went to go into the bathroom, and the doorknob was all wet and there was a puddle of water on the floor for no reason, just a random puddle of water on the floor. And we lived across the street from a horse farm, and I look out the window and the horses are losing their minds and they're kicking and they're like screeching and bucking, and that's never happened before. And then I look out my side window and my neighbor has a ladder just leaning on his house. It's not going anywhere. It doesn't reach any windows, doesn't reach the roof, just a random ladder on the side of the house. Things like this happened for the next 7 days. I was fine, totally fine. And the night of the Halloween party, we're sitting there and we had it all set up. My grandmother had no idea what this movie was about, just not do horror, like didn't know anything about it. And I was like, hey, when the movie ends, can you like call the house phone and freak everyone out? Like, we're not going to answer it, obviously, because we're all going to be screaming, but can you just, it'll be really funny. Let it ring like 3 times. And she was like, great, done. I don't know what this means, but sure. Halfway through the movie, the phone rings and we all scream and like push each other, and, nobody gets to the phone in time. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to go get some popcorn and like decompress. And I go upstairs and I was like, hey, that was actually perfect timing because we weren't expecting it. And she goes, again, has no idea what The Ring is about. She goes, oh no, that one wasn't me. It was a wrong number. It was the little girl.
Oh my gosh.
Sure.
I mean, you're still here, but
I'm
maybe
still
because
here.
you shared it with everyone at your party.
I showed it to all my friends, and so I'm fine. Somehow this became my comfort movie. This should have scarred me for life. This should have been that movie that haunts me that I never watch again because, oh my God. Instead, this became the movie that taught me about habituation. I put it on that one closet scene, the first stinger. I paused it until it became funny and was like, this is great. Okay, I can do horror. This is awesome. I watch it all the time. I love this movie. To me, it's a perfect movie. I know it's got flaws. It's a perfect movie.
One of my favorite movies is The Faculty. I understand. That's so wild. I was gonna share my similar sort of like spooky experience, but yours is so much better. I guess I will just for the sake of sharing it because it's fun and these are the fun stories we love to tell. My similar one, not as extreme, was with The Exorcist when my parents finally let me watch it. It was one of the only movies my mom had not been allowed to watch when it came out when she was younger. And so she was like, you're absolutely not allowed to watch it. But of course my dad was like, yeah, sure, you can watch The Exorcist.
Good old dad.
But I had like a few like weird occurrences after it that were kind of similar in that they were like mimic the movie where well, first off, it bears sort of sharing that I grew up in a 666 address. So that's always super fun and super spooky. And I always had this weird, like, it wasn't a water stain. I'm not sure what it was to this day, but like creepy cracks above my bed that they plaster over and repair, and they just keep reappearing over time. And like just right above my bed. And after I watched The Exorcist, I remember going through like a used bookstore and a book randomly fell off the shelf and like hit me in the head. And it was a French translation. I'm in Canada, a French translation of The Exorcist. So it was L'Exorcist. It just freaked me out so bad. And there were just other things that happened in the house, like in the film and in the book. Like one of the first signs of like the possession of the home was like a rat infestation that like they couldn't find evidence for, right? And that happened in my house where you could hear something crawling through the walls at night and falling through. And then when we called someone to have a look at it, there was no scat, no feces, there was no evidence of anything in our attic. And when I left for university, according to my mother, who is very superstitious, but according to my mother, it stopped. And then when I came back during breaks, it would start up again. So I had this like huge like paranoia that I had something following me everywhere I went. So definitely not as intense as yours, but it was like very freaky.
Yeah. And there's something about The Exorcist, man. I also, yes. Hello, Kat.
Her name is Jester.
Hello, Jester. My copy of The Exorcist moves around my house of its own accord, will show up in a random box of like bits and bobs and technology. I'm like, you don't belong there. Nobody put you there. It'll go missing for months at a time and then show up just on the shelf, boop, right where it's supposed to be. Like it's that book, man. Yeah, and that movie.
Like Pazuzu is supposed to be a wind demon, but instead apparently he's just a trickster. Like
yeah. Are there any, so would that be sort of your like movie that haunts you, or do you have one that's like that, like scarred for life type? Do you have a different one?
The one that probably, I'm over it now, but the one that probably lasted longest for me was Gremlins.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yes. Yeah. I literally just picked my foot up off the floor. I was like, whoa.
Yeah, there's something about, well, I watched it really young and it freaked me out. And I would have like an annual Gremlins nightmare for like years and years and years and years. But like there's something now still where I get kind of like uncomfy with any sort of plots that's like this thing that seems, to be one thing, and it's either going to get bigger or multiply out of control. Like even like Tribbles kind of freak me out. So like, like any of those narratives, I'm just like, no, thanks. So I guess that would be the one. That's the one that did it to me. There's something about those puppets that just
got
into my little child brain and stayed there.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely like, I have a thing and I don't even consciously do it anymore. But if my like legs are hanging over the side of a couch or a bed or whatever, I'll just like pick them up because I don't know, there could be something under there. I don't know.
Could be something under-
Gonna grab my ankles. No, thank you. Yeah. So is it Furbies are terrifying? Yeah, they are.
Yes, absolutely.
God. Oh God, the Furbies that will like glitch out. Like, have you seen videos of those? It's so scary. It's so scary.
I have a friend who's
No, thank
obsessed
you.
with like the custom Furbies and desperately wants a long Furby. And I'm just like, they're testing our friendship.
That's amazing. I never had one as a child and I so wanted one. And then all of my friends were like, no, they're terrifying and they wake you up in the middle of the night and it's real scary. Don't get one. And I was like, okay. I guess fine. Oh gosh, I have so many notes on my page. Let me see. Let's do some like favorites. Do you have, so we've talked about like favorite movies and stuff, but do you have a favorite monster? Do you have a favorite horror monster?
Yes, but now that I'm trying to think of it, I've never seen a movie monster in my entire life.
I mean, same.
Oh, who would be my favorite movie monster? Do you have a favorite movie monster?
I'm very, I mean, I'm gonna use monster kind of in the way that
I was like, is it a human monster?
Yeah, I'm very partial to Hannibal Lecter.
Okay.
I love him. Which again, and this tells you a lot about who I am as a person. I had a recurring nightmare as a child where I was being chased by something. I was in like an open area and someone or something was hunting me, and Hannibal the cannibal would show up and tell me to hide, and then he would go eat the person that was hunting me. I had not yet seen Silence of the Lambs.
He was very, he took a liking to you, you know, you were.
Did. I assumed that it had been like on in my house as a child, and I was like, who's that? You know, but for years. And then when I finally sat down and watched Silence of the Lambs, I was like, he saves me in my nightmares. So I'm a big fan.
That's so awesome. I watched that movie way too young. I also love it, but I watched it way too young.
It's legit.
It's it's less cute when you're like a 7-year-old like quoting the movie at people. Someone mentioned It Follows earlier. I do like that monster a lot. Yes. Because you don't know what it actually looks like at any point, because it's just taking on whatever persona. And the other is that it's sort of like the fact that it's just like slow and relentless.
Yeah.
Instead of being like, you know, the fast and pop out at you sort of creature, or like that like obvious predator. It's like the slow stalker that you know will get to you eventually. You just have to put people in space between you if you want to survive. Like, what? Like, it's just such a cool concept, and we don't have any sort of explanation for like what it is or why it is. I think about that one a lot.
That movie, that's one of those movies that the more you watch it, the more amazing it is. Because it's one of those movies where like the first time I watched it, I was like, I don't know if I understood what just happened. Like, what is going on? And then I watched it again and I was like, all of these things are on purpose to make me deeply unsettled, because I don't know when or where this is happening. Like, they're in a pool in their bathing suits, but there's dead leaves and the trees don't have leaves on them, and that person's wearing a sweater. And what is this technology that they have? Like, when it's so brilliantly done, I love it.
I desperately want to make that little like clamshell
thing.
Every like at least twice a year, like I go into like different like tech parts like sites, and like I'm like, I could make this. I could make this. I'm not like that technologically savvy. I can like hook up a circuit that can make fiber optics work. So that means I can make an ebook, a fully functioning ebook, right? like e-reader.
Absolutely. I have
But
full
yeah,
faith in you.
thank you. I will do my best. I'll report back if I ever make this thing. But yeah, like I think that monster's so neat. And also like the time, like you said, like it's so disorienting because you don't know like where or when you are, but also like the monster itself and the faces it chooses. Like at one point it chooses, and I didn't realize this until I watched it like so many times, but like at one point it's like taken on the face of her father, who I believe has like passed away or something like that. They don't say anything. They don't tell you. You only know from clues upon like, because she has like a photo of him somewhere. And it's just so wild.
Wow. Oh man, that movie. That's a good one. It Follows Monster. That's a good one. We've got some good ones in the chat.
Yeah, like some iconic ones, Xenomorphs. The Thing
Mhm.
is absolutely like the monster.
Mhm.
I think
Love
like
The
it
Thing.
goes without saying.
Yeah, so good. Someone asked, where was it? Judith asks, can you discuss the science behind our attraction to horror movies? Is the amygdala involved?
All right. I feel like those are sort of two questions, but it's a great
Yes.
question. So our attraction to horror movies, and actually there's a whole chapter on this in the book. So I don't want to get too deep into it, but the sort of the long story on that front is that there are a lot of theories for why people are attracted to horror movies, and I don't think there's any one reason, neurologically or physiologically speaking, because we all might have, and yes, absolutely, your amygdala is involved. It's part of that fear circuit that is lighting up and getting engaged when you are watching horror movies. So, and it is responding to, because that fear circuit and the amygdala are also very connected to parts of your brain that, pull up and reconsolidate memories. Obviously very useful for us in terms of evolution, because we want our threat perceptions and fear responses to be connected to our memories, so that we can recognize and respond to threats. All this to say that yes, that part of the brain is lighting up, but it doesn't explain why you like it, right? Because ostensibly your fear circuit being activated and freaking out and preparing you to either run away or fight or take on something, or just lie on the ground shivering, valid. Those aren't pleasant experiences. Part of it's explained physiologically by what's known as excitation transfer theory, where you're experiencing arousal, but since you're the thinking part of your brain, us humans are blessed with having enough cognitive development that we can critically think about what we're seeing on screen and recognize that it's not real. And so once that sort of melds into that cascade of hormones that's kind of rushing around your body and getting you ready to fight, we can actually shift that arousal over to enjoyment. So there are a few aspects of the horror movie experience that really lean onto excitation transfer theory. Like that's the obvious one, where it's like scary thing, jump scare in your face is like getting those arousal levels up and then transferring it over to enjoyment. Use of humor in horror does the same thing. The best horror movies have some humor in them to help us play with tension, like we were talking about earlier, because it's not a fun viewing experience if we're just at a static level of just horrible tension the entire way through. You need those ups and downs, and so even getting you laughing in order to trigger a different kind of arousal and then shift it over into also works as well. And I see that there's a sort of a bit of a follow-up. Oh, that's not a follow-up. It's a little bit different, but is there an element of control and processing trauma to watch a scary thing and know that you're able to stop the experience and know that there is an ending? There's research that points to that as being the case. However, it really depends on yourself and your personality and how you process trauma. Because while there are, some techniques that work pretty well for a lot of people, there isn't any one therapeutic technique that works for everyone, especially with complex PTSD or severe trauma situations. But absolutely, there are a few things that happen in terms of using scary films to process trauma. I know a lot of people who who like it for exactly that reason, because they can sort of be outside of it as they experience it, um, and almost use it as sort of like an exposure therapy, so that we can get that sort of habituation and hopefully extinction of certain fears, or certain like triggers that are associated with trauma. Other people, and there was a really cool study that came out just I believe it was at the end of last year, specifically about grief and horror films. And it applies to the sort of like trauma processing piece too, where the fact that most horror films follow someone either going through traumatic events or working through grief. Like think of like Midsommar, that whole movie is a grief fest. But like a lot of other movies open with someone mourning a loss or working through a loss. And these movies, being narrative pieces, have a resolution at the end. And usually that resolution comes with some small victory, not always, but even without a victory, resolution kind of gives us an endpoint to work with. So there's been some evidence to show that horror can be used as a processing tool for trauma and for grief, just in that you can follow along someone else in their journey through healing or their journey processing grief, and sort of see the wins there and not just have like that endless road ahead of you of sadness.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That is so interesting. And it's a good point that so much horror has grief in it.
Yeah.
That it's something that I don't necessarily like notice, but now that you've said it, it's like, oh yeah.
Well, even like Scream is a 5.
Yeah.
Thank you.
5.
5 movies about grief, like, and trauma. Like that's literally Sydney's narrative through the whole thing. Like we open the movie of her already grieving her mother, and we see her at different points, like then moving to become a trauma counselor, I think in like Scream 3. And then now in her latest, like one of the best lines, and this isn't a spoiler, but one of the best lines in the latest Scream movie is someone asks her if you get over it eventually, like do you get there, and her response is eventually. And that was like the best line in the entire movie. It's what I'm talking about. It's like following someone through that journey and seeing where they that they can get through.
I love that. Just saw another question pop up. As a young person, I systematically exposed myself to horror to not feel so shocked in the future. Same. Could it be a method to train myself to control my response should something happen in real life, not apocalypse level happenings, but general emergencies? Oh, that's an interesting question. And you do talk about this a little bit in the book. I feel like I feel like this tackles that like habituation versus desensitization.
Yeah. And what I talk about in the book is that like watching it in a movie will never, as much as parents are afraid that this will happen, it's not the same as seeing the real thing.
Right.
Because like we can watch someone being like violently assaulted and or killed in a horror film and we'll be like this. And like even and I don't know if other people in the chat have experienced this, but even seeing like live footage, we've had in the recent years a lot of live footage of real violence, and I try to avoid it, but when you see it, it's way more shocking because you know it's real. It's horrifying because you know it's real. So from the standpoint of controlling your reaction, I don't think you can really predict or necessarily use horror to predict how you're going to react in a situation, because the realness of it and the additional sensory information of being in a real and threatening situation changes the game completely. It's your amygdala and like your different parts of your brain that have recall of similar situations in horror films may pull up those memories, not in a way that you're probably thinking about it, because no one has time for that in an actual scary situation to actually be like, I think I remember something like this happening in Texas Chainsaw Massacre too. But you may have like a little bit of like in the non-conscious sort of part of your brain, something sort of tickling back there. More than like, I couldn't say that it would necessarily prepare you to have a certain kind of reaction unless you were actually like moving your body in tandem or something and using it as like a true training experience to like actually physically practice what you would do. And then you'd be, I'm just going to move my cat's butt so she doesn't accidentally mute me. Where she doesn't actually, where you lost my thread because of my cat. But basically, unless you're using those as actual triggers for behavior, then I don't think it would really happen.
Yeah. And kind of bouncing off of that, the fact that parents and society will blame horror for these violent tendencies, and it's like, no, watching horror doesn't make you evil. Like, we know the difference between a movie and real life. And if you don't know the difference, there was already something there that was going to cause these things.
And as a follow-up to, it's like, yeah, it's really fascinating to watch characters' reactions in horror and analyze them. And we all see like the woman in heels running and falling down and falling down and falling down. Yeah. And you're like, wow, like, how are you doing this? What is happening? But you know what? Sometimes when you're on autopilot and trying to get away from something, basically all your brain is saying is go, and like in like that fight or flight response, you actually, like, there's evidence that you actually tunnel vision, because you're just focusing on what you need to. And so absolutely, it makes a lot of sense that people who are just running and just picking a direction that's away, aren't necessarily going to see that tree root or, perfectly flat piece of ground that's going to trip them up.
Yeah. I mean, I'm always watching it like, I don't fall when running, but like, let's be real.
Like the other day I tripped over a curb trying to put like a piece of garbage in a trash can. Like I felt very graceful about it too. I like did like a 180 spin and ended up seated. And I was like,
that's amazing.
And just from there, put my trash in the bin. I'm like, this wasn't embarrassing at all.
Incredible. Yeah, Kristen literally slid down the stairs today. See, we're all, yeah. Oh man, that's amazing. I want to talk briefly about modern horror, because this is like, I'm very into the horror that's happening right now. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on it. I saw Nope on Friday. No spoilers. We're not going to talk about it, but Jordan Peele, Ari Aster. I'm very into this horror kind of like, I guess, renaissance. I mean, horror never went away, but like, it feels like we're in a kind of new renaissance of horror right now. And I wonder if you have thoughts on it.
Yeah, I don't have any like contentious thoughts about it. I know there are a lot of people who are very for, very against, like the sort of like different streams of horror, I guess we can say, that we're getting right now. But like, again, to what you were saying, like, it's always existed. And the same thing is true for like, quote unquote, elevated horror always existing. Like, the difference being is that when elevated, I'm using this very loosely because I know no one likes the term elevated horror gets recognition, that's when the film tries to distance itself from horror. Like we saw that with The Exorcist. Once it started getting Best Picture, then Friedkin was like, it's not horror, it's a story about faith. And like the same thing happened with Jonathan Demme and Silence of the Lambs. They're like, this isn't horror. And I'm like, well, are you sure about that? And so at least what I love about what's happening now is that we are getting these great films like the Jordan Peele films, the Ari Aster films, that are gorgeous and that are getting recognition, and the directors are saying, hell yeah, it's horror. And I don't think it takes away from the B movies or the more general kind of like or like the budget movies, or the even just like the more independent goopy monster classic slasher type movies. I think that horror is such a sprawling sandbox of a genre that there's like more than enough room for different types of sandcastles. I don't know where this metaphor is going, but where I think things are going, especially with this type of horror, is that I think we're going to see them getting more and more specific, because we're seeing that, like, the Jordan Peele films are a perfect example. His movies are so specific, and they're where earlier, like if you go back a few decades and you had a monster or a situation, that situation could stand in for a few different social theories, to the point where we can kind of recycle some of those plots, and people would take something different from it. It's like, last year's Red Scare is now this year's I'm afraid of current political stuff.
Yeah.
But Jordan Peele's films are super, super specific. He's not the only one, but he's just, because we mentioned him, he's on my brain.
Yeah.
That where you can really see them as a snapshot of the time, that like hopefully we won't be able to like easily transform into a new narrative. It's just such a specific narrative, and I think that's important for right now. And I think that given where like overall cultural conversations are going, like that we're going to get some just extremely, extremely specific films targeting very specific messages that aren't necessarily like as universal as some older horror films. And I think we'll just reach sort of like a tipping point of specificity and then broaden back out again.
Mm-hmm.
I am not a horror movie critic or reviewer of any sort. So you heard it here first. Maybe I'll be completely wrong in my predictions, but that's the sense I'm getting.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think that's really true. And I also think that I just think the directors today are doing really cool things with the genre. So like thinking about Ari Aster, for example, with Hereditary, and playing with it felt like he was playing with our brains, because he had those things hidden in the shadows that in theaters you couldn't see, but watching on a laptop you can see them if the screen is tilted. So it's like they were there and we were seeing it, but we weren't seeing it. And like there are like moments in that film where things are sped up just enough that it's like it doesn't look sped up, but it doesn't look normal. And like, and then to go to Midsummer, where everything is bright and saturated and it's all out in the open, and he's just, every time I find out like, oh, he's working on something new, great, what is it? I'll go see it. Like, incredible. Can't wait. Yeah, love him. So yeah, I'm just very into the world of right now, the horror that's coming out right now. I just think it's incredible. And if anyone hasn't seen Nope yet, go into it as blind as possible. That's my biggest piece of advice. That movie, 2 thumbs way up, and that's all I'll say.
I feel like going into horror movies in general as blind as you can is always, unless you have like specific things that you need to avoid.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's just how I do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I get so enraged by some of the trailers that come out where they're like, here's all of the beats to the movie. And you're like,
and we already know that seeing that. Yeah. And like seeing the scariest moments in a trailer primes us to look for them in the film. So it lessens their impact when we're seeing them. So like, like that's science. Like we know that repetition for like jump scares and stuff like that. Like we know that its effectiveness is reduced the second time you see it. So why would you show that to me in a trailer? So that's most of the time I watch movies. It drives my wife insane because we'll start a movie. She'll be like, what's it about? I'm like, I don't know. I have no idea. I just like the title.
That's amazing. Well, that's kind of what I've been doing this past week. Like I watched some old favorites, and then some I just pulled up Shudder and I was like, oh, this looks good. Click. Let's see. Because I think that, it is fun to just go in and be like, I don't know what this is about. I hope I like it. And I did most of the time. Have you, we talked about this kind of before the event started, but have you watched any horror recently that you've been really into?
I watched while I was traveling. It was nice because then I could like access like US Shutter and kind of see some stuff that I'd been sort of holding out for. And okay, this one I don't think this will be a hit with everyone, so take this recommendation with a grain of salt. But every now and again, I really like a good like mumblecore horror. And I watched it's a few years old now, but I watched After Midnight, which is incredibly slow. It's incredibly slow. So like if you don't like slow movies, skip this one. But it had a fantastic unexplained monster. And just like, I don't know. I really, really liked the setup and payoff at the very, very end. Because that is, it was one of those ones that's so slow. You get to the point where you're wondering like, are they actually going to like go through with this jump scare that I'm hoping is going to happen? Are they going to do it? Are they I'm like moving my mouse on my screen. I'm like, there's only a minute left. Are they going to do it? And it was just like, it was just really, really interesting. I think definitely for a film that almost gets almost doesn't show its monster at all. It does a really good job. And I really appreciated sort of narratively how it got around showing its monster until pretty much that last chunk of movie. Is that vague? That's a little bit vague. Sorry for everyone who hasn't seen the movie.
I think it's perfect. I'm intrigued. We are almost at the end. So folks in the chat, if you have questions, pop those in the chat or in the Q&A or whatever, and we'll hop on those. But as a reminder, Nightmare Fuel is available from Gibson's. If you ordered a copy, these are your copies. I'm shipping them tomorrow. I needed to like make a little stack so you could see it. This one's mine. You can't have this one. This one's mine. This book is fantastic. I mentioned this to Nina before we started recording, but I was going to ask some more sciencey questions, but I really want you guys to read the book because there's no way that I could talk intelligently enough about the sciencey parts of horror. So definitely pick this up. It is broken down in such a cool way. Nina really just dissects the genre in such a great way. And there's some humor throughout. And again, the watch list is phenomenal. So definitely pick this one up. It's my staff pick. You have to. I'm requiring you to. It's my staff pick.
Those are the rules.
Those are the rules.
It looks like we have a question that's, what's the best intro into horror to get a newbie hooked? And I think if you want to answer this one too, you can, but it's a tough one because it really depends on you and what you're interested in.
Yeah.
But where I like to start people off usually is with like the 90s horror cycle for a few reasons. For one, it's you tended to get more sort of mainstream horror in the 90s, where like even the 80s slashers, though they were like marketed towards teens, it was like still predominantly towards like teenage boys. And the 90s really, really, really opened it up to like realize that, because they realized that that teens had a lot of disposable income and they wanted to get that money out of teens' pockets. So, but like from a narrative standpoint, a lot of the horror in the 90s is meta horror, like with Scream in 1996. That's a good place to start if you haven't seen it. Like the whole kind of conceit of Scream is that it's taking a really incisive look at slasher and horror tropes, but in a way that's still a really fun story. So that's a really good place to start if you haven't watched any horror whatsoever, because it kind of it gives you a crash course essentially on how horror movies work.
Yeah.
And then from there, anything you watch, you'll kind of like hear Randy Meeks in the back of your head, like explaining what's happening to you.
Yes.
So that works really well. I usually go from there and like force people to watch home invasion movies, but I know that's really hit or miss with some people. Some people find home invasion movies very, very freaky. But I like Adam Wingard's You're Next a lot. I think it's a really good one.
I love that movie.
Which has like a very good final girl as well. That's like often like under sort of like recognized. Like Erin from You're Next is just like final girl of my heart. Just super, super, super good.
Love that one. Steve asks, does comedy and horror change the way our brains process the horror?
I think in terms of the comedy and horror, I definitely in the sense of that breaking up of tension and that excitation transfer theory sort of aspect. In terms of, I'm glad I not to digress, but I'm glad that I'm like totally on board with Corrigan here. But definitely humor plays a huge role in horror, even ones that aren't horror comedies, to sort of like break up that tension so that you can relax a bit and then jump back into the scare. Without that, and it doesn't always have to be like knee slapping funny, but like without that, like you just get exhausted from always being at like a high arousal state. So you need to sort of drop down into a relaxing place so that you can kind of jump back in again and feel that fear. But in terms of like horror comedies where it's like more comedy than horror, I see those as living a little bit more in like the gross out and disgust camp more often than not, where you'll have a lot of really funny stuff and the horror tends to be something that's really gross rather than something that's really scary, which tends to amplify the humor using disgust more than it's doing the other way around, which still has its place in horror and the horror genre, but it definitely lives more firmly in that like gross out camp than it does in the like, this movie has a goal to make you scared sort of.
It's so interesting because depending on the day, I am either in the camp of I want the horror that is just truly scary all the way through. I mean, like I need some levity, but like the ones that are like a Hereditary, like this is going to scare me. And then other days I'm like, give me Psycho Gorman, please. Like I want it to be, some jump scares are fine. It's like maybe a little gory, maybe a little violent, but it's like also got this silliness to it that is like, I don't know, when I can like be laughing my way through a horror movie and then also get a jump scare, like I love that. Yes, Cabin in the Woods.
Cabin in the Woods is a great example. Yeah,
exactly. Exactly that. Tucker and Dale versus Evil.
Yes.
Like they're I love a horror comedy of that style. But then also I love the ones where it's like, what did we just watch? Velocipaster.
Yes. Velocipaster. There's a sequel too, isn't there now?
Is there?
I think there's a sequel. Yeah.
Oh, must watch. Gonna go home and watch that tonight. Where they're just absurd, right? And and they know, and it's very meta and it's very silly. And I love that. I just love horror, guys. Can you tell? Let's see. We had a couple of other questions here. For movies based on books. Oh, I love this. Do you ever read and compare elements from each? I do. Yes. What about you, Nina?
In what way? Like in terms of like narrative or in terms of like?
For me, it's both. I will kind of look at how well does this follow the plot? How did certain things translate if they chose to do that?
I do have an example actually, since you mentioned Bird Box earlier. That was one where a scene that was terrifying to me in the book, which was the scene where I can't remember the character's name, but where he like does the experiment to tie himself to the chair and like watch the closed circuit video, and the description of basically him straining against his restraints to the point that like the fat and muscle tissue, sorry Elizabeth, on his legs were like rending, was just so disturbing to me. And then watching the film, it was like, it had no punch. Like it just didn't hit at all in the same way. That was one where I really felt the difference. But generally I don't do super close comparisons. I think because I kind of I kind of just decide to be along for the ride for the different media and just like I choose to interpret them as like two separate stories that happen to share a source, or that happen to like be related by media blood.
They're cousins, not twins.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. But like definitely that was one that stood out to me, where I was so hyped to see it on screen. I was like, this was fine, but it did not hit as hard as it did in the book.
Yeah, that book was one of my that kind of launched my horror reading phase, because I had a coworker who had the arc of it, and he was like, you need to read this. And I was like, oh, this is terrifying. This is fantastic. And then the movie is like, fine, it's fine.
It's good.
It's good
Love you,
on
Sandy
its
Bullock.
own. It's a good horror movie all on its own. But when you do compare it, like there are nuggets like that in the book that you're like, it didn't quite translate. And like I remember when A Quiet Place came out, which I loved, but I remember joking that I was like, oh, Hollywood couldn't figure out how to do Bird Box, so they did A Quiet Place. and then Bird Box came out, so I was like, no, they figured it out.
That's really funny.
Let's see. I know there was some other questions. Do you feel that there has been any movie that's gone too far?
I mean, probably. One that I've seen, I mean, usually when I see things as going too far, it's not necessarily the scare that I have, that too far aspect, like where I'm feeling that too farness, speaking real well. But where I tend to see it go too far is like when you start seeing, the isms coming through, or like where, a gratuitous rape scene that didn't need to be there. Like it doesn't need to be 12 minutes long and graphic. It doesn't make it scarier. And because there's, or like when you start seeing like, just like hyper long, ultra violent, like attacks on like queer folks or on people of different races, you can get across a much scary, like if your point is like, these people have real fears that are justified and suffer violences, and like if that's the message, there are ways to get that across in much scarier or impactful ways than creating something harrowing.
Right.
Is there a place for something harrowing? Sure. Is it for me? Yeah, probably not. I don't need that. I know it exists. I exist in the world with some of these identities, and I don't need to sit and watch it.
Yep.
So that's kind of where I sit on that front in terms of too far.
I'm right there with you, and I know my friend Corey is also. This conversation has come up before. Of that was gratuitous. That didn't need to be there. We understood before you did. Okay, thank you. 100%. And I think we as horror fans can critique horror and still love it. And I think there are a lot of places where the horror genre can do better. And I think we as consumers can kind of push it to do better, just in what we choose to pay for. It's that age old vote with your dollars.
Yeah. And don't be afraid to like look into the people like, and the people who are telling the stories too, because sometimes you'll be really excited about a film and then realize that like, oh, maybe actually I shouldn't be giving money to people. I don't want to call out specific people, but like folks who have very clearly committed certain violences. And those people are out there and part of very big franchises. So don't be afraid to do some research.
100%. Hello, Elizabeth.
Hello. All right. So I made it through. I'm going to take I'm going to take your tip and, just cover my ears, when, Ryan talks about, I'll just cover my ears when Ryan talks about, I can handle about that level. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. This was great. I mentioned in the chat, I really am sad that I am not able to tolerate horror, because the horror community is so joyful and enthusiastic. I read a lot of other different genres, and I love when another genre lover is like, have you tried this? And something about watching and reading genre media just allows you to be enthusiastic and happy about things. So much more so than many other more serious pieces of media. And I sit here on the outside watching the chat sidebar just scroll with enthusiasm and comments, and I'm like, I want to be a part of that. Zombies are like, I watched a trailer for a zombie movie, just a trailer, and I was jumping at bushes rattling for 3 weeks. So it just doesn't work. So just know that I'm on the outside pawing it through the glass. Well, that's actually really cute.
And we're jumping at that.
I want to come in, but it's not good for me. So I am a delicate flower. But fortunately, we had Ryan here to take us through this conversation, which was excellent.
And from the empty, dark bookstore, by the way, which is terrifying.
It's a little creepy.
Especially when you hear sounds that you're like, what? There's no one in this building. What was that? Don't worry about it. It's fine. It's fine.
Thank you, Nina, for joining us. Thank you to our audience members who signed in. This has been a lot of fun. Next time you're in the US, look us up. I mean,
come on over.
A fun time. So thank you so much, Nina.
Thank you.
All right, that's it for us. Stay spooky, folks. Have a great night.